Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. God, there are frogs in my throat tonight, and they're multiplying. There is a new brown racism. It's a racism that says that whites have oppressed and colonialized the brown people of the earth. Hence, whites are guilty of an original sin, a sin they were born with, the sin of their colonialist, imperialist, slave-owning ancestors. In other words, whites are morally corrupt. Whites are the only filth of the planet. Only brown people are pure, and only brown people are noble. Says the new brown racism, the time has come for social justice. The time has come to funnel wealth and positions of authority to the brown people. But who are these brown people? As you'd expect, they are African Americans and possibly, just possibly, Asians. But most of all, they are Muslims. How did the Muslims get into this picture? Through a PR campaign that has been going on since 1948. The most expensive PR campaign in the history of the world. That PR campaign has been financed by 57 Muslim nations. It's a PR campaign to which just one of those 57 Muslim nations, Saudi Arabia, has donated $100 billion. And it's a PR campaign of a kind favored by the holy books of Islam, the Qu'ran and the Hadith. Those books make it clear that Muslims are the only people God wants to rule this planet. Muslims deserve to tower over all others, the holy books say. In fact, the holy books exclaim that good Muslims are required to humiliate, torture, and often to kill those who refuse to knuckle under to Islam. In other words, the intellectual left, my group, has been infiltrated, conned, and hypnotized by Muslim supremacists. Let me repeat that phrase. The left has been conned by Muslim supremacists. The left has made itself a shill for a religion that oppresses women, that suppresses free speech, that calls for the death of its critics, and that demands perpetual war. This is a racist religion. There's an irony here. Whites, according to the new brown racism, are permanently polluted by their imperialist past. But the greatest imperialists on the face of planet Earth have been the Muslims. In the first 100 years after Muhammad's death in 632 AD, the Muslims took a territory 11 times the size of the conquests of Alexander the Great, 5 times the size of the Roman Empire, and 7 times the size of the United States. And Muslims still hold all of those territories, with one exception, Spain. The Muslims held Spain for 700 years, twice as long as Western imperialism. Then they were kicked out, which means that Muslims are the greatest imperialists in history. The Muslims are also the world's biggest colonialists. They moved tribe after tribe from Arabia to distant locations from Morocco on the Atlantic to Malaysia and the Pacific, 7,166 miles away. And those Arabs did not colonize in order to live peacefully with their new neighbors. They moved to harvest the wealth for themselves. They moved to become plutocrats and aristocrats. And they moved to make war in the hope of acquiring yet more new territories. Western imperialism subjugated people in radically unacceptable ways, but Western imperialism ruled for less than 450 years. Muslim imperialism, on the other hand, has reigned for 1,200 years, nearly 3 times as long. But there's more. Muslim holy books call for humiliating the folks Islam conquered, for reminding these subspecies, these dhimmi, of their humiliation hour by hour and day by day. And Islam's holy books call for even more. They call for the utter annihilation of any indigenous local culture and its replacement by Sharia. But that's just scratching the surface. Take a good, hard look at the history of Muslim slavery. The West's slave trade was outrageous, appalling, and demonic. It killed roughly 1 million blacks. That's a Holocaust. But the Western slave trade was nothing compared to the slave trade of the Arabs. For every slave taken from Africa by Westerners, 10 were taken by the slave traders of the Arab world. 10. Yes, you heard me right. For every slave taken from Africa by Westerners, 10 were taken by the slave traders of the Arab world. And for every African killed in the American slave trade, 9 were killed by the slave trade of the Arabs. Yet the Muslims now claim to be the allies of the blacks of America, the crucial allies in movements like Black Lives Matter, the logical organizers of the Women's March on Washington, and the logical people to hire as newscasters and pundits? Give me a break. The West's slave trade lasted 500 years, a long, long, and brutal time. But the Arab slave trade lasted 1,800 years, over 3 times as long. What's more, the West invented something vital. It invented an anti-slavery movement, a movement that abolished slavery. Muslim nations, brown nations like Saudi Arabia, did not abolish slavery until roughly 1962, 156 years after the British. And the brown Muslim nations abolished slavery only because they were pressured by Westerners, by white Westerners. Westerners, white Westerners, invented more than just the anti-slavery movement. They invented the anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist movements. In other words, white Westerners invented the very ethical standards by which the so-called brown people are judging them. Yet Muslims are the folks we are now called on to lift to high position in America, all because they have convinced America's black activists that Muslims too are brown, and that Muslims too are oppressed. I have news for my fellow lefties. Muslims are oppressors. The bottom line, it's time to end the brown myth. It's time to end the brown narrative. It's time to end the brown supremacist movement. It's time to call out the fraud of the Muslim infiltration. It's time to go back to all men and women are created equal. It's time to recognize that both brown and white people have rights and have made major contributions to our shared culture, to our shared values. It's time to reject the new brown racism. This is Howard the Humongous, speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make. Or, want to know why? Ask how. And now for the sleazy, slimy, mysterious, always elusive little, I wonder if I can find it, off button.